Hello everyone and welcome back to our course. In the previous section, we learned how to change our score text in the game to increase whenever the player kills an enemy. In this section, we're going to build the game over and restart functionality. Starting with game over. We want to be able to control what happens when the game ends. The game would end when our player has collided with an enemy, because the objective of the game is to avoid the enemies. So join me in our game widget header file. We are going to declare our onGameOver function. So this will be void. In the public category, we'll call this onGameOver because it's some functionality that we want to happen when the game ends. As well, we can pass in here our score because when the game ends, we want to show the player's final score. Next, let's go ahead and implement this onGameOver function inside of our C++ file for the game widget. So here we have load and set score. Let's also initialize onGameOver. This is void and it comes from uGameWidget, and we already called it onGameOver, and we specified that it has to take in a parameter that will be an integer called score. Okay, here what we're going to do is set the text of our score text, kind of like we did with set score. And we're going to check if score text is not equal to null, then we can change the score text to say game over final score and prompt the user to restart the game. So here I'm going to grab score text and I'm going to use the function set text. Here I'm going to create an ftext, use the ftext from string function, and I'm going to grab here an f string from a piece of text that I will say game over, and then we can have a \n for a new line. So let me just include here \n, remove that square bracket. This will create a new line, and then I'm going to pass in the score, and we can add here with just a plus as the simplest way. We can add here our final score, which is going to be an f string from an integer of our score parameter. Okay, then we can also prompt the user to restart. So let's add here a piece of text, and we can have here again a new line. So with \n inside of the string, we can add here press R to restart. Right, there we go. Let's close up all those parentheses. Make sure you don't have any missing. And this is going to be our function body. If the score text exists, we're going to be able to change its value. You want to add null checks where possible in order to protect your code from breaking. So we don't want to try to set a text of something that's not null. So null checks are always a good idea. All right, so here, this is very similar to just the function set score, but instead of simply showing the score, we're just adding more to what we're showing in that user interface. All right, now if we want this to appear, we have to just have a location where we actually have on game over being called. So let's go into our game mode here, our C++ file for the game mode. And when would our game actually end? Well, the game would end when our player collided with an enemy. So let's go into game mode here and let's declare an onGameOver function. So I'm going to just go down here and declare this void. We're going to grab our first person shooter game mode with A in front, so A first person shooter game mode, and call on game over. Here, when the on game over of the game mode is called, we want to grab our current widget property and first cast it to a game widget and then call its on game over function. So here I'm just going to cast it first. So let's say uGameWidget, and we're casting our current widget, and then we're going to call on game over and pass in the score of the game mode. Okay, so we have to make sure we have a current widget defined inside of our game mode. Great, we do. Okay, so we have to make sure that can be accessed inside of the C++ file. Then we also have on game over. We want to make sure our game mode has that on game over function. So let's go into the game mode header file, and let's also declare here a public function. We'll call this our void on game over. All right, there we go. Let's save that, and then let's go back into our C++ file, and now that function will be able to access. So when are we actually going to call on game over on the game mode? Well, we would call this when our enemy collided with the player. So let's go into our code for our enemy controller C++ file. Here we can see currently we have the game set to paused when our enemy collides with our player. But let's go ahead and change this up. We can use the same line we did inside of our increase score function. I'm going to call here on game over instead of increase score. So I'll just pass here on game over. There we go. And then I can also set the game to be paused. So on game over is just going to change the text that appears on screen, but then we also do have to still pause the game. And you could move this into on game over if you wanted to. Alright, so then we can go back, check to make sure all of our code here builds. And once we build, we can see all of our error messages have disappeared. Okay, so we've been able to successfully build the project. That's a great sign. Next, we can go ahead and launch the project, so we can compile it with the debug button, and we can test to make sure that if we touch an enemy, our game over message appears inside of the text. Let's go ahead and test this out. We will press debug or F5 to launch the Unreal Editor while in debug mode. All right, here we go. Now I can press play. And if one of the enemies touches me, look at that. I see game over, score 0, press R to restart. Now currently if I press R, nothing happens. So join me coming up in our next lecture. We're going to build out the restart functionality to enable our player to restart the game. Hello everyone and welcome back to our course. In this lecture, we're going to implement the restart functionality so our player can restart the game once they collide with an enemy. For that, we're first going to implement the input in Unreal, and then we'll write some code in C++. So in Unreal, make sure you're not in debug mode. Just open up your Unreal project, and we're going to go into the settings in the top right-hand corner. Here, we're going to then select Project Settings. This will open up a window full of a bunch of different settings you can change. We're interested in the engine category and specifically the input property, which you can also just search for. Here we have to set what is known as an action binding. This means that we can map some kind of action like the press of the keyboard or the press of the mouse or a button on the controller. We can map an action to some kind of functionality. So let's open up action mappings. You can see we already have action mappings for jump, fire, and reset VR. These came with the first-person shooter template. If you expand jump, you can see all of the bindings. We have a space bar on the keyboard that allows you to jump, and also other buttons on controllers. As well, there are axis mappings, which are for continuous actions like movement, because you don't just move forward one time, you move forward continuously. And for moving forward, we have WS and up and down, as well as controller buttons. So we have axis mapping and action mappings. For our restart functionality, that is an action mapping because it just happens once at a time. We're not continuously restarting the game. We just press one button to restart and we can instantly restart the game. So we're going to create a new action mapping here. This is what you have to do anytime you want to accept a new form of input. So I'm going to press the plus button here, and then it's going to prompt me to fill in first a name so that I can recognize my mapping here in C++ or in Blueprints. I'm going to call this restart. Then underneath that, you can select a key value, all right, whether you're using the mouse or the keyboard or the gamepad. You can select from all of these different devices. We're going to use the keyboard, so under the keyboard, we can then select a specific key, like a number key or a letter key. Let's choose R for restart. You can also add Shift, Control, Alt, Command as well to be part of the binding. But here we're just using the R key. So this means we're going to be listening for if the R key is pressed. That will be recognized as a restart mapping. Awesome. But how do we actually make sure that the game restarts when we press R? Well, for that, we're going to need some C++ code. So let's close our project settings, and we can now close our Unreal project. It will also save. And let's go back to Visual Studio. Here, first let's open up our game mode header file, because here we have to declare our onRestart function. All right, so let's go ahead and define that. You can define it similarly to how we defined onGameOver. Okay, so we just can make it void. It won't return any value. And we'll call it onRestart. All right, then we have to implement the function inside of our corresponding C++ file. And it's going to be implemented similarly to how we implemented onGameOver. We call the return type, which is void, because the function doesn't return anything. We call the class where it resides, which is a first-person shooter game mode. And we call the function name onRestart. Then we use curly brackets to open the function body. And here we can specify what we want to happen on game restart. What we can do is we can just reopen the current level. So we're going to use gameplay statics for this, because this class has the function open level. And we're going to pass in here several arguments. Okay, let's just first make sure we have gameplay statics, because if we want to put this to use, we have to make sure we have included it. Okay, so yes, we have Kismet/gameplay statics. All right, here we go. We're going to call open level. We'll pass in this as the game mode that we're using. Then we're going to pass in the name of the level that we want to open, which is just going to be the current level. So what we can do is we can open up the current world and get the name of the current level. So here I'm going to convert it to an F name, and I'm going to grab here my world, get world, and use get name to return the name of the current world or the current level. All right, there we go. And false. That is going to allow us to open up our same level that is currently open. You can feel free to build this, make sure that it runs. Now, yes, we have created this onRestart function, but when do we actually call this? Well, we have to specify when we want this function to be called, because by just declaring it and creating its body, we have just enabled it to be used, but we have to then specify when it should be used. So what we have to do is when the game begins, we have to take our action mapping, that restart action mapping that we just made, and we have to bind it to this function. So let's scroll up to begin play. Here we go, and we are going to then get our current world and get our first player controller. Then we can grab its input component. So what we're grabbing here is the input of our first player. And we want to bind an action. The action is restart. This has to match the name of the action mapping that we just made. We're going to then use IE pressed because we're listening for when it's pressed. The game mode is this game mode. And then the function we want to bind the action to comes from our a first person shooter game mode, and it's called On Restart. Okay, so here we have bound that action mapping restart to our On Restart function, which means whenever the restart action is triggered, we're going to enter our On Restart function. And on the Unreal side, we'll be continuously listening for the restart action mapping because we made it a binding. So Unreal will be listening for when it's pressed. And when it is pressed, we'll open the level by passing in our world context, our level name, and whether we want the level to be absolute. All right, we can now save all this. And one more thing that we can add, in fact, that we have to because our game pauses whenever we stop or whenever we collide with an enemy. Because our game pauses, we have to make sure that our input mapping will execute even when the game is paused. Because typically, if your game pauses, no longer can you listen for any action or axis mappings. By default, they just freeze as well. That's why when you pause the game, you can no longer move because Unreal is no longer listening for any input from the player. But you can override that. If we want some functionality to still be available even when the game is paused, we just have to add here to this binding action. We have to add a property be execute when paused. So this is a Boolean, and it specifies whether you should execute this action even when the game is paused. And if you set this to equal true, then that's going to make sure that this action is going to be able to occur. This restart action will be able to occur even if the game is paused, because by default, these binding actions don't occur if a game has been paused. All right, so now let's go ahead and test out our code. I'm going to hit debug to compile the code, and then we can test it once Unreal launches. Okay, Unreal has launched in debug mode. Now I can press play, and my game still works as before. But this time, if I collide with an enemy, I can now press R and the game restarts. Awesome. So that validates that our restart functionality indeed does work. And that does it for this project. Congratulations, everyone. You now have a great starting point for a game. You could easily modify the 3D models in the game, the environment, and have yourself this simple local game, single player first-person shooter. There's a lot more you could add. You could make the enemies spawn even faster over time and have them spawn around the player more frequently. You could as well change the difficulty and add more levels. Perhaps have some goal that the enemies are blocking that you have to get to. Or have a timer where the enemies are going to be continuously spawning and you have to survive a certain amount of time, like a whole minute in the level. The possibilities are quite endless with games, but during this project you're able to create this practical game and you're able to learn C++ along the way. So you're able to learn a new programming language with a project at the end. So you should be very proud of yourselves, and I'll see you in another project.